The day isn't long enough when I'm with you. The day isn't long enough with hours so few. There should be more than 24 when lips have so much to say. Why must the night offer delight, then hurry away? The thrill of your sweet caress should linger on, but just when there's happiness, the day is all gone. We say hello, and it's time to go before a kiss is through. The day isn't long enough when I'm with you.
Hey guys, the settings for the two picture profiles we'll be talking about, a full explanation on how to use them, the raw footage, and let's do grade the log profile will be in the description. So the first picture profile we'll be talking about is Chili Relleno. The image that you're seeing right now is actually straight from the camera. There hasn't been any editing or noise reduction added to the image. I named this picture profile Chili Relleno because I like Chili Relleno burritos. Well, I like chili relleno burritos, and you could just order a chili relleno burrito a la carte and then pick it up. You don't have to cook it yourself. So I kind of thought that's how this picture profile works. It's a profile designed to be used straight out of body without grading. The settings might have been updated, so check the link in the description for that and the instructions on how to use it. But as of now, chili relleno has the gamma curve set to Cine 1, which we found has the least amount of noise while still retaining good dynamic range and low noise. The color space is Pro, which is the same shape as 709 and therefore won't get that green tinting or magenta tinting to kind of mitigate some of that. If you use a bigger color space like S.Gamut or even S.Gamut.Cine, you tend to get magenta tinting, so we use color space Pro. The black gamma is pulled down, it's narrow -7, and this is just to add a little bit of contrast back to the picture profile since Cine 1 is flat. The knee is set to 95% with a slope of +5. We did that because the max output of Cine 1 is 109%. So we have a knee at 95% to pull down the white point to 100%, so you're not losing any information past 100% in the highlights. This picture profile is designed to be used straight out of body without grading. In Premiere or Final Cut or Avid, it's designed to be shot, cut, and then posted. So if you want, feel free to play around with any of the settings to match the look that you want. You could add a color tint to it, you could underexpose it, overexpose it, play with the knee, play with the black gamma. But I suggest leaving Cine 1, the color space Pro, and especially the detail settings, how we recommend them because it's essential for having low noise, but also for keeping good dynamic range and color fidelity. Also, we recommend at most shooting, if you're shooting 4K with an ISO at 51,200, that's the highest, actually that's the highest native ISO you could shoot at. But going beyond that, we found the noise was too much. And then also if you're shooting in slow-mo 120p, having a max ISO of 25,000 ish, maybe 20,000, but definitely not going above 25,100. The second picture profile is cookie dough, and I named this cookie dough because just like how you should cook cookie dough, you should grade this picture profile before you post it. This is a log profile like S-Log, meaning it's going to look flat out of body and you need to add back contrast and saturation for the image to look how it does in real life. Also, like S-Log, its dynamic range is greater than 100%, but instead of 1300% dynamic range for S-Log, it's 460% dynamic range for Cine 1. And instead instead of 106% max video output, it's 109% max video output for Sony 1. So all that really means is you should expose it how you want it to, and then bump up the ISO a third of a stop. To grade this picture profile, 1. Bring down the blacks till it hits at 0. 2. Pull down the mids till it brings back contrast. 3. Pull down the whites until it hits back at 100. 4. Add back saturation. And you could add back saturation with more of an emphasis in the shadows for a rich look, or you could add back saturation with more of an emphasis in the highlights for a vibrant look. And then lastly, 5. You need to pull down the greens in the highlights slightly, increasing the magenta, and the reason you have to do this is because of the shape of S.Gamut.Cine, which is slightly different than the shape of the color space of A7iii, which gives it a kind of greenish look. So you just have to pull down the greens a little bit, increasing the magenta, and you'll be good to go. So that's the short explanation. You have 2 picture profiles, one for if you don't want to grade, and one for you if you want to grade and get the absolute most image quality you can out of this camera. The next segment of this video goes into the tests and reasoning behind picture profiles and how we arrived at them. So the first thing we had to do before we even started testing was define what is low light, and then define what the ideal picture profile in low light would be. So low light essentially is when there's not a lot of light, which means you have to shoot at a higher ISO. And doing that means you're going to have more noise, less dynamic range, and less color fidelity. And there's going to be more blacks and shadows in the image. So the ideal picture profile for low light is one that performs well when shooting at a high ISO, which means you have good dynamic range, good color fidelity, and low noise, and performs well in blacks and shadows, which you'll get more of when shooting in low light as compared to if you're shooting during the day. So these are the tests that we performed to figure out what the optimal picture profile would be to meet those 2 criteria. Grading torture test. A common technique when shooting photography in low light is to slightly underexpose, shooting at a lower ISO, and then raise the exposure in post, which results in a cleaner image. So is it better to underexpose when shooting video and then raise it back in post for this camera? The test we did was we exposed every picture profile at -1 and at 0 exposure using high ISO, and found that raising exposure in post increases noise. There's a difference between photography and video, and if you want to read the full explanation on Sony's documentation, you can. I'll have a link in the description for that. But essentially the reason why there's a difference between photography and video is when you shoot photography, you're shooting in a format that's raw and it's uncompressed. It's like food that hasn't been cooked yet. You could do a lot more with it. For photography, it allows for more alteration without the image degrading. But if you're shooting video, the information is compressed. So it's like if you have ingredients that are cooked already, there's less options to what you could do with them. So for video, the optimal workflow we found was to slightly overexpose it using the ISO by about +0.3 and pull down the exposure in post, which crushes the noise. So the second test we did was black level versus grading. Black level, which is sometimes called toe, controls how light or how dark black appears in the image. Is it better to raise the black level on camera and then pull it down later, which is similar to the first test we did, or is it better just to shoot at the native black level at 0? We shot the same scene using the same settings 2 times, but one had the black level at -11 and one had the black level at +10. We graded the +10 down to match the shot at -11 and then compared the results of the noise at multiple areas, and we found that it's just better to shoot at the native black level at 0. There was no advantage of going either way, and actually it introduced noise to the image. The third test we did was the black gamma test, and black gamma, as differentiated from black level, what we just discussed, raises or lowers the exposure of shadows and mids, but it does not control the black point. Selecting narrow only adjusts the darkest part of the gamma curve that's like right next to the black point. Selecting medium adjusts the darkest part of the gamma curve next to the black point and some of the shadows. And selecting wide adjusts right next to the black point, the shadows, and some of the mids, stopping at around 50%. And the emphasis of the change was around 25%. So what are the best black gamma settings for shooting low light? Well, we shot wide, medium, and narrow at -7, 0, and +7 using an ISO of 51,200, so that's the highest native ISO for this camera, and concluded that 1, black gamma does not increase or decrease dynamic range. I thought it might have affected dynamic range, but that's when I was young and naive. It doesn't do anything. It just controls how the light is rendered onto the SD or output. It doesn't really control how many levels of light the camera can capture. And the second point we found was that medium +7 or narrow -7, those two settings had the lowest noise. So we used medium +7 on our log profile that's used with Cine 1 so that we could retain a lot of the shadow detail and then be able to pull it down in post if we want. And we use narrow -7 on Chili Relleno so that it gives a little bit more contrast out of body while keeping a very low noise level. Fourth test we did was gamma curve. So if you were to write down everything that you're experiencing right now, what you're hearing, the sound of my voice, what's happening on screen, what's happening around you, if you were to write down all of the sensations that you are experiencing right now in 5 seconds, would you be able to do it? Probably not. I'd say it's unlikely. The reason for that would be because it's just too much information in too little time for you to render it onto a piece of paper. So the same thing happens with a camera. There's so much information that hits the sensor. The camera has to decide what information to keep and what information not to keep. So it has to decide what color it wants to keep and what light it wants to keep, how much of the shadows, how much of the mids, how much of the highlights to keep. And this doesn't happen just once like a photograph, but it happens 24 times a second or 60 times a second or 120 times a second if you're shooting in slow-mo. So there's a lot of information the camera has to process. What gamma curve does is it controls how light is recorded, adjusting the blacks, shadows, mids, highlights, and white. It doesn't control the color directly. Some picture profiles like H-Log, before it would force you to use BT 2020, which is a different color space, but now you could use 709. But gamma curve itself just controls the luma. So what is the optimal gamma curve for shooting in low light? Well, again, we shot every gamma curve in the dimly lit room at 51,200 ISO, and we found a bunch of things actually. H-Log 1 had the lowest noise compared to H-Log 2 and 3, and this actually agrees with the documentation it'll be linked in the description. According to documentation, H-Log 1 has the most noise reduction compared to H-Log 2 or 3, but the dynamic range is restricted. The maximum video output is 87%. H-Log 2, the maximum video output is 95%, which is more, and H-Log 3, the maximum output is 100%. So if you're shooting in low light, you should be using H-Log 1. I don't know why Cody Blue and Scott use H-Log 3. The noise is the highest out of all the H-Log profiles. Still is actually darker by 1/3 of the stop at the same ISO. So if you were to shoot the same scene using movie, still, and let's say Cine 4, it still will look 1/3 of a stop darker, even if you use the same ISOs. It's really dark in the shadows and the black point. If you're just to look at the picture profiles from a noise standpoint, it would perform the best, but it's black and like you can't see anything. There's no gradation in the shadows. Of course, the noise is going to be good because there's no information that will be noisy. It's just black. You can't see anything. That was interesting, but still. S-Log, of course, had the most dynamic range and it had the most color noise. If you look at just grain or noise that isn't colored, kind of like sprinkles, but just like the, I guess, gamma noise, be called gamma noise. S-Log did really well, but it just has so much color noise. It's there's better options than S-Log. Cine 1 and H-Log had similar dynamic range. H-Log had better dynamic range, and those two were right under S-Log for having the best dynamic range. And then Movie, Still, and 709, which are the basic picture profiles, had the least amount of dynamic range. Okay, going to the documentation and the differences between Cine 1, 2, 3, and 4. Cine 1 is a flat picture profile that Sony designed to have good dynamic range. So it was like a hybrid profile that isn't completely flat like S-Log, but it's also not 709 1:1. Cine 1 has a dynamic range of 460% when the exposure is adjusted to 33% video output with 18% reflective grade. The maximum video output of Cine 1 is 109%, which is greater than the 100% that you would get on 709, which is probably, if you're like watching this on your iPhone, that's the maximum output that you're seeing on your screen right now. So that's Cine 1. If you took Cine 1, copied and pasted, and then you squished it down so that 109% video output becomes 100% video output, that's what Cine 2 is. We found that doing the squishing increased the noise by about 5%, which is pretty bad, especially in the shadows. The reason why Sony did this was they wanted a picture profile that's easier for grading. You wouldn't have to bring down the mids and the waypoint. But today it's so easy to do that. You could literally just pull down on one point and it'll correct it for you. And on top of that, the noise that's introduced with Cine 2 makes makes it by far the worst Cine profile you could use of the 4. So Cine 3 is if you took Cine 1 and you left the maximum video output at 109%, copied and pasted it, but you added contrast in the dark areas and in the highlights, basically an S-curve, that's what Cine 3 would be. Cine 4 is if you took Cine 3, copied and pasted it, and then you pulled down even more in the shadows, which adds more contrast, but you leave the highlights the same. That's what Cine 4 is. So of all the gamma curves, the best gamma curve for shooting a low light is Cine 1. It has the best balance of dynamic range, low noise, and good color fidelity. The 5th test we did was on detail. Detail, essentially, if you look on the left, see how there's no lines added to the character, but if you look on the right, on Archer's face, on his jaw, on his cheekbone, or on his hat, you can see there are lines that emphasize the edges of stuff. What detail does is the camera adds lines to the edges of stuff in your image to make things look sharper. Manual lets you fine-tune the detail settings. If you have this set to auto and then you fine-tune the detail settings, it's not going to do anything, so you want to switch that to manual. VH sets the detail either to be stronger vertically, even, or horizontally. BW balance controls if there's more black detail emphasis or if there's more white detail emphasis. Limit controls the color of the detail. If you have it at 0, the black detail is going to look gray, the white detail is going to look more on the gray side, but if you adjust it to 7, the black detail is going to look very deeply black, and the white detail is going to look very very bright white. Crispining removes detail that causes noise, so it's very useful for our purposes. Highlight detail adds even more highlight detail on top of the BW balance that we set earlier and adds even more white detail, emphasizing the images of brighter stuff. So what are the optimal settings for low light? After shooting through the settings again and checking the noise, we found that as of now, this could change, but I actually don't think it's going to change because these were pretty black and white. Ha ha ha. Joke. The best settings were -7 for the detail, which is the camera's adding the least amount of detail. Manual, so that of course you could adjust the settings. VH balance at 0, which is an even balance between vertical and horizontal detail. Type 5 black-white balance, which is less emphasis on shadow detail and more emphasis on highlight and white detail. Limit at 7, where the blacks are deep black and the whites are a bright white, as opposed to kind of a muted black and muted white detail. Crispining at 7, so it limits the noise the most it can, and the highlight detail at 0, which does not further add any detail into the highlights. So the 6th test we did was knee versus grading. This is the knee point, which is sometimes called shoulder, which limits overexposure and blown out highlights. Toe or black gamma controls the shadows. This controls the highlight fall off. What are the optimal knee settings for shooting in low light? Is it better to leave the knee off or to pull down the highlights in camera and then push them in post? We shot the same scene 2 times. One with the knee at 75% and then pushed up the highlights in post. One with the knee off and then pull the highlights down to match the first image with the knee at 75%. And we found that, like we found before, grading down doesn't hurt noise, but grading up, or when you push exposure, it hurts the noise. So we found that just leave it on auto, which is the off setting if you're using Cine 1. Auto just doesn't touch the highlight fall off when you're using Cine 1. The 7th test we did was black gamma versus ISO, and I don't know how useful this test was really, but this is how it went. We were wondering, is it better to shoot at a higher ISO with a low black gamma or to shoot at a higher ISO with a high black gamma? So we were already assuming that we were going to push the exposure slightly so we could pull it down, but at that point, was it better to have low or high contrast, essentially with a high black gamma or low black gamma? So we shot the same scene, testing both ideas, and we found that at 50%, which is where your midtones are, it made no difference to the quality. But if you went up 60, 70, 80, 90%, which is the highlights, lower ISO was cleaner, but at 25%, where the shadows are, a high black gamma was cleaner. So the ideal thing to do, if you don't mind grading, is to use the black gamma set at mid +7, which is a higher black gamma. Overexpose it slightly and then pull it down, which gives you the most information, and pulling it down crushes the noise, as we discussed earlier. But of course, if you're going to use the footage straight out of body, we recommend using medium -7 because we found it had the least amount of noise, but feel free to play around with this to get the look that you want because you're not going to be grading in post. The 8th test we did, how many tests did we do? We did 12 tests, okay. The 8th test that we did was S-Log2 versus Cine 1.
Another really important tip is to keep your ISO at its native limits. So for the A7 Mark III, the native limit for S-Log2 and S-Log3 is 800 ISO. You want to keep it in the native limit because once you start bumping up your ISO, you lose dynamic range. So it's basically pointless at this point to shoot an S-Log if you're not getting your dynamic range.
I thought this was interesting what he was saying, and I didn't doubt what he was saying because it made sense, but I wanted to see by how much, and then how much of a difference does S-Log2 graded look versus Cine 1 graded shooting a low light at a high ISO. So again, we shot the same scene using the same settings, but S-Log2 was overexposed, exposing for the highlights, which is a little over +2, graded it down, added contrast, and added back color. And Cine 1 was pushed slightly by about a third of a stop, pulled down, and we added color to that as well. And we found that Cine 1 was better, but S-Log2 was actually pretty good. Of course, S-Log2 had the better dynamic range, and S-Log2 had pretty terrible color noise, and that's the Achilles heel, especially when you have to add back color. The color noise is just, it's just too much. So that was the biggest reason why we don't recommend using S-Log2, even though it does have a pretty good dynamic range and some of the image was pretty clean. It's just too much color noise. The 9th test we did was color depth, and what color depth does is it adjusts how light you can see it goes up to white or how dark going down to black individual hues are rendered. So the camera will actually go in and will look at all the magenta hues and make it lighter or darker, or all the green hues, make it lighter or darker, cyan, red, and the other hues. Does making a color lighter or darker affect its image quality? Yeah, it does. We shot a cyan wallet that I use for soaring filters, and we found that if you lighten the color depth, which makes the hue lighter, it decreased the color noise but made the gamma noise. Gamma noise is like the static basically that doesn't have any color to it in darker areas worse. So we found it's just best to leave the color depth at 0 for all of them and then grade them in post, so that way you're not introducing more noise into the image that you don't have to. And I'm assuming this is because the camera is doing more work to process the image and it introduces more noise. The 10th test we did was black level and dynamic range, and this was like another useless test, but I was wondering if dynamic range can be increased by black level. What dynamic range is how many levels of light the camera is recording. So this is less dynamic range. You can see that there are less levels of light between black and white, and more dynamic range, there are more levels of light between black and white. If you lower the black level, does that increase the amount of levels of light there are between white and black? The answer is no. We shot the same scene with the black level at 0 and the black level at -15, and we found that the camera's ability to capture how many gradations of light didn't change. What changed was how the camera was rendering the information, not how much information that it can capture. So no, The 11th test we did was saturation. Saturation controls the intensity of a hue in an image, and this should be differentiated from color depth, which controls how light or how dark or how much white is added to a hue or how much black is added to a hue. This is just the intensity or the strength of a hue. So you can have a really strong green or you can have a really weak muted green, and it kind of makes things look sad almost. Is it better to have the camera saturate the image or the computer saturate the image? We shot the same scene twice, one where the image was saturated by the camera and one where the image was saturated in post with the NLE. And we found that adding saturation in post increased the noise in colorful areas by 2%, but if you were to add saturation in body, increase the noise by 4%. And we found that adding saturation increased gamma noise, which is like the I don't know what to call it, I just call it gamma noise, but it's like a static, black and white static, especially in areas greater than 70% luma, which is where the highlights are. So for optimal image quality, it's best to slightly undersaturate and only add back color where you want it in post, which limits how much noise is therefore added by raising the saturation. This is a side note, but if you want to give the image a rich look, you could add more of an emphasis of the saturation in the shadows and then have a fall off of that saturation going into the white point. But if you want to keep noise level, especially the color noise, down when you're shooting at a dark environment, it's actually best to add saturation with emphasis more in the highlights, especially if you're using a high ISO like 15, 20, 50,000. It's better to add the saturation in the highlights because that reduces the amount of color noise that gets added to the shadow areas. So the 12th and final test we did was a comparison between other picture profiles you could find online or on YouTube, and look at the noise, look at the color, and look at the dynamic range. So you can see for yourself on screen what the images look like. We have Cookie Dough, we have Make Art Now, we have Kody Blues Cine 4, Kody Blues H-Log3, Scott's H-Log3, and S-Log2. From just the dynamic range standpoint, if you look at the shadows where the palm trees are, going all the way up into the highlights and the white point, if you look inside the store at the bottom and see where it gets blown out and what information gets kept. S-Log, not surprisingly, has the best dynamic range. That's followed by, it's actually Kodi Blue's Cine 4 profile. I think it's because I messed up exposing Kokido. But I have a hunch if I were to redo this again and not overexpose as much, I would not have blown out the highlight so much. At this point, I exposed it by 2/3 of a stop. But anyways, yeah, so number 2 was Kodi Blue, the number 3 was Kokido, number 4 was H-Log, depending on how you grade it, and then 5 was the still picture profile, which was Make Art Now's picture profile. The crushing of the blacks is so intense, the black point and the black gamma on still is so pulled that it just basically deletes all of the shadow information. Therefore, the dynamic range isn't there because it's not recording anything, it's just black. If you look at it from a color standpoint, the 2 H-Log profiles may stand out more than the other profiles. That kind of makes the other profiles look muted in comparison. When I graded these profiles, I really tried to like give each one the best chance it can because I'm really interested in seeing what's the best picture profile. From a color standpoint, H-Log unsurprisingly had the most color information. It looks really great and it doesn't look blown out, if you will, the saturation. This is the saturation. I didn't add or subtract any of the saturation to the H-Log 3 profiles, and this is how it looks out of body. After that, from a color standpoint, S-Log 2 looks really good, Kokido looks really good, and then the last 2 would be Still or Kodi Blue Cine 4. In terms of low noise, Make Art Now had the best test results in terms of numbers, but again, that's because the gamma curve of Still crushes the black point and black gamma so much that there's basically no information. So when you go in there and look for noise, well, there's no information there, so the noise is going to appear low, and the dynamic range isn't that good. So there was that. Number 2 was Kokido. In terms of noise, number 3 was Cine 4, which was Kodi Blue's Cine 4 profile, and then after that it was Scott's H-Log 3 profile, then Cody's H-Log 3 profile, and then unsurprisingly, in last place we had the S-Log 2 for noise. So that's the end of the video, folks. I hope you enjoyed the information. This video took actually a long time to make, mostly because I'm pretty lazy. I started in November and then we're here now. So we did, I think this is my 4th or 5th voiceover because I didn't like the other ones. We did at least 20 or 30 different shoots for testing. Actually, probably more, but we'll just say 30. We did a ton of B-roll shoots. It's almost a terabyte of footage in total. About 12 to 15 hours writing the storyboard. Tons of hours editing, maybe like 20 or 30 hours editing, and then doing the graphics took a long time. And then I actually had to learn how to use After Effects because doing the graphics in Final Cut was too intensive for my machine, so that was about like 15 hours, 20 hours of graphics. So yeah, I didn't realize, like, when I watch a video on YouTube how much time goes into doing stuff like this, but just to give you guys an idea, like, yeah, this is how it is. So I thought that was interesting experience. If you found this video helpful, please let others know that it was helpful or not helpful by either liking or disliking this video. It just helps for if someone goes into a video and they can immediately know if this video is worth their time or not, because this is probably going to be a long video. If you want to support doing stuff like this in the future, when you get the picture profile, you could add a little donation on top of it. This video was one of 3 videos that I want to do on the A7 III. This one being about low light. The next video I want to do is about normal light mid-tone picture profile and what would be the best settings for that. And then the third video that I want to do for this camera is a review and setup guide and all the little like miscellaneous tricks and tips. Like, for example, if you shoot at 120p as opposed to S&Q, for some reason you get better highlight detail, like stuff like that. So stay tuned for that, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.